Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm delighted to have Lord Richards of Herstmonceux, who is here, and we're going to be talking about his amazing book. This is called Taking Command. But I just want to read the introduction, which really captures it nicely. He served in the Far East, Germany and Northern Ireland, before commanding deployments in East Timor and Sierra Leone, where his intervention in the Civil War without official sanction from London proved decisive in ending years of factional fighting. He later served with NATO and led ISAF forces in Afghanistan. David Richards became Commander-in-Chief Land Forces of the British Army in 2008 and held that role until 2009, when he was appointed the Chief of the General Staff. In 2010, he was appointed as the Chief of the Defence Staff, the professional head of the British Armed Forces, and served in that position until 2013. He was made a life peer in February 2014. David, welcome. It's lovely to have you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Well, it's great to be on it. Thank you very much for asking me.
Yeah, not at all. And of course, it was your military assistant when I think you were Assistant Chief of the General Staff or one of your roles, and Stuart Tootle, Colonel Stuart Tootle, who talked with great fondness about working for you. And he put you forward as one of the inspiring leaders that he worked with. Now, you've had a great career, and I do recommend to people, I'm going to do a review of the book, that they have a read of this. But I was particularly taken as a young schoolboy by going to the Citadel, where 29 Commando Royal Artillery had their base, where you did some of your training, and being asked to abseil as a young man off the city walls with the waiting tourists below eating ice creams. But it was a huge thing for you to do right at the beginning of your career after Sandhurst. Tell me, how did it shape your view on life being a commando and the things you learnt in that training?
Well, I think, I don't know if my friends would agree with me, but I think humility was the biggest thing that I was reminded of, because I like to think, although I'm a self-confident person, that I also have a good dose of humility, in part, taught me by my parents, who were of that, they were like that themselves. And I watched the way they treated people from all backgrounds and all that sort of thing. And even though my father was quite successful, he was a very clubbable chap. So although successful at school and so on, I do think that probably any tendency I had to be a bit pleased with myself, the commando course soon got rid of it. The other dimension, the other thing I realised or remember most about it, and it's linked, I suppose, is that we were, in those days, we did the course with the Royal Marine recruits. Not their officers, but their recruits. This meant that people from all backgrounds and capabilities, all very physically fit, obviously, but all sort of backgrounds and capabilities in terms of other, things other than just physical, were on that course. And we were put through the mill, and you learn to rely on people who perhaps normally, as a young officer, one would never have got into such a relationship with. And I remember many of them to this day, and we're talking a long, long time ago now. I suppose without really thinking about it, they made me realize the interdependence of us all, whatever rank or role we might play. So the commando course and the Royal Citadel was, a great learning curve. But I like to think and I don't know this great debate about genetics and environmental factors in the way you are shaped, but I like to think they were building, or it was building on something that I genetically thought of being anyway. Of course, there was the physical side too, which toughened me up very quickly and very early on in my career.
Yeah, and I noticed, of course, you have not only the commando dagger, but the parachute wings as well. Was that part of the training that you did at the time? You did both courses?
It was when I was with the Commando Gunners. I got my parachute wings in a gap from when I was at university. Every summer I had to go back to the army, and I was put forward for the parachute selection course through P Company. And yes, I mean that was another pretty tough course. I mean, I think at the time, like a lot of people probably, I had visions of then going into special forces and so on. So this was part of a sort of journey to that way. But I have to say, my eyesight has never been my great. And a friend of mine in 22 SAS who said, "Come on, when are you joining us?" He said, it doesn't matter about the fact you're blind. And I said, no, I think it might do. When then they said I wore contact lenses. I said it might do. And if my contact lenses sort of pop out in the middle of some skirmish in the desert, I would be letting people down. So for quite rarely for me, I decided I shouldn't pursue that. Not certain by any means. Obviously, I would pass the course. But I did. I thought I'd done well enough in terms of toughening myself up and proving myself to myself, not to others, by doing the commando course from P Company.
Yeah, that's a huge combination. And I myself did the All Arms P Company. And again, like you, we were the signals at the time. I was Royal Signals. And we did it with the Royal Engineers. And again, all ranks. And it was a really good leveler, as you say, as you're being sent back as the officers to go and drag another soldier forward and carry their kit as well as yours. And of course, the corporals always hated the officers, and they particularly made it harder for us while everybody else was resting. Wonderful. And then it was lovely reading in your book about your father, Jim, who was an army officer too, and your mother, Pam, and their upbringing. Then Eastbourne College, where I saw you sort of in the cadet ranks there. I think, were you a junior under officer or someone leading the cadets at Eastbourne? Your career then went on, and you had some fabulous different roles, commanding your regiment, and then on to command your brigade, where you and I met, and we sat in the turret of our Warrior in Osnabrück in the days when you were commanding 4 Brigade, and that was a great time for you and a great time for me. And then at some stage, I'm not quite sure where it fitted with the timeline, but you certainly had this incredible time in Sierra Leone in the Civil War, where you were given a very constrained mandate. But you, I suppose some would say, and in your book, you sort of confessed to it, you slightly defied orders and just saw that what was needed on the ground, the man on the ground who saw what was required. What's your view to others when they feel that they know better than the orders they've been given, and they actually probably the right thing to do, even though people won't like it, is to defy orders? Any views?
Well, I think I'm a keen student of military history, like so many of us, and I always liked to think that if I was given poor orders or orders that led to, say, unnecessary loss of life or whatever it might be, or you wouldn't achieve the aim, that I would have the moral courage to argue back and hopefully remedy those orders. I remember visiting Verdun when I was a major or lieutenant colonel, and coming away thinking, if ever I was in that position, what would I do? Would I have, rather meekly gone along with, in this case, really a political more than a military requirement to do what they did there? And fun enough, as you're looking at things like this, leadership. I bought in the Richards family, we have boiled eggs every Sunday. It's a tradition. And I bought an egg cup, a little wooden egg cup in Verdun, with Verdun written on it. And I'm not an emotional chap, but it did leave a real mark on me. And I when someone said, "Well, why have you bought that egg cup, Richards?" One of my peers, and I said, because I want to be reminded every Sunday of what stupid generals or generals that lack moral courage might result in. And fun enough, you know, I have repeatedly, I literally every Sunday I have my boiled egg still out of the Verdun egg cup, because I'm not mainstream in you know, in respect of many things going on today in my thinking. And Sierra Leone, I visited a couple of times, like 2 or 3 times before, the year before, because the operation you're referring to took place in 2000. I knew it quite well. And if you just cast your mind back a few years, we'd had the Rwanda tragedy, and we'd had the what happened at Srebrenica. And I was asked or ordered to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation. And because I knew the country quite well, 2 things came out of it. One, I knew that the RUF rebels, which were our primary enemy, were really a bunch of drug-crazed bullies. And I felt that, you know, a sort of robust response would probably, you know, still let ardor a bit and could be more successful still. And the other thing was that I did not want to be associated with a Srebrenica or Rwanda. And I just sensed, I brought those 2 together, that I could actually do more than I'd been ordered by some margin. But then I had the problem of, how do I do it? Because I'm not so stupid that I could sort of, you know, disobey orders openly. So I contrived to use similar tactics to that which would be required for a non-combatant evacuation operation, but that which had another purpose, which was to delay and then stop the RUF rebels. And when I was asked, why the hell are your troops deployed so far forward, or whatever, I just made sort of I said things like, well, I've got to do that in order to leave the airport, plenty of room to, you know, for planes to get in, or I couldn't let them get too near Freetown. And I could tell people didn't really believe me, but they couldn't quite handle it. So I got away with it. And I have to say, bless now Field Marshal Charles Guthrie, because he came out to visit, in part potentially to sack me, because there was a lot of criticism back in England from the politicians as well as some of my rivals, brigadier or major general sort of level. And he said, no, Richards is doing a fine job, leave him to it. So I think a bit of luck, and having ultimately, in his case, a really good visionary and also, I like to think, morally brave chap in the Chief of Defence Staff at the time, I think was very helpful. But I give you a bit of background. And we were very lucky, Jonathan. You know, not a single soldier was lost. We pushed the RUF back, got the UN going, and we were back home within 6 weeks.
It was a huge success, and thank goodness. And I'm just reading David Petraeus, who we had on this series, his book with Lord Roberts, Conflict, which is very interesting. But so many of the accounts are of wars that haven't worked out, that haven't gone well. And the fact that Sierra Leone was a bit like Malaya and the Oman, a success, Aden rather. It's great to be able to be involved in an operation which was boundaried and could be seen as a success. Apparently, is it that one that they might be making to film? Who knows? Maybe one day.
Well, you've been well briefed. Who knows? I thought it had died a death, but it's still going. 13 years on from when it was first mooted, and it has just sort of been kicked back into quite I think healthy life. So you never know. And of course, the question always is, who's going to play me? Well, I'll keep that to myself unless you've got an idea or two. I've lost you.
The thing that struck me in the book is the number of fascinating people that you met. I mean, I'm going to at times just get you to talk about each of them, little thumbnail sketch of them. But Field Marshal Charles Guthrie, I got to meet when I was ADC to the late Field Marshal Inge. And I just wondered what your experience was of those 2 generals, what their best qualities were that you saw that sticks with you to this day for both of them.
I think their humanity, they both had. I mean, they're quite different people, but interestingly, they were good friends and fellow officers. but Field Marshal Inge was fearsome, as you know, but beneath that, he was also intensely human. And when someone who's really fearsome suddenly smiles at you with a big grin, you somehow love him even more for that. But he's also very caring. He always wrote a note, often in his own hand, to say thank you for quite minor things that were probably our job. Now, Charles Guthrie, I can't remember him ever writing anything to say thank you, but his demeanour was such that he left you always sort of on a high, very cheerful, very cheeky in many respects. Not sort of cheeky to people like me, but you could see he was irreverent. And hugely capable, and had a character that very effortlessly, to my observation, seemed to get on with people from all backgrounds. And I mean, I've never heard a bad word said about him, actually, other than he's intensely lazy. I don't know if that's true or not, because I mean, good people make it look as if they're lazy often when they're not. And I think my memory of me worked pretty hard. But if he was lazy, then he was even more capable. So I think, yeah, both great men, but quite different. But both left people like you and me feeling better for being in their presence.
Yeah, no, very true. And I think of when I sat around or brought things into the Army Board meeting, and he was there, very, very skilled, and that ability to look that things were terribly easy, a bit like Sebastian Roberts, who was the MA1, General Sebastian Roberts, who again loved to be rather languid and be as efficient as possible. But I think it was General Rommel who talked about the four different categories of leaders: the stupid and hardworking, which you should shoot because they're taking miles in the wrong direction; the stupid and lazy, and then the bright and hardworking, and then the bright and lazy. And he said, take the bright and lazy ones and promote them to the highest ranks, because they get the job done and then have time for sport and family and recreation.
Yeah, it was great, very astute, and there aren't many of them.
No, very true, very true. And you had a fascinating time. One of your jobs was brigade major in Berlin, in the time when the British had a presence there, and it was a divided city. And you had to look after Rudolf Hess. And not only that, but you then got to be a bodyguard for a Hollywood starlet, Joan Collins, in 1988. Tell us about both of those two. That was a great story.
Right. Well, it was still, as far as we were concerned, at the height of the Cold War, although little did we know when I arrived there in late 86 to be the man who was really running the day-to-day operations of the brigade, including into East Berlin. And so, I, without realizing it, I was quite a sort of powerful guy at my level. There was a brigadier above me who did sort of senior high-level stuff, and then there was a major general who ran the British sector, as it was called. So it was straight out of the Cold War, well, actually post-Second World War arrangements. Spandau Prison lay within the British sector of Berlin, and the only remaining prisoner was Rudolf Hess. While he was in the prison, he was responsibility of the four powers, and they rotated every month: America, Russia, France, and Britain. I can't remember when it was when the Americans were in charge. He'd was taken out to a makeshift sort of, I don't know, what do you call it, a sort of sun room made out of a porter cabin, really, to get a bit of sun. And he strangled himself with a cable that was being electricity cable that was being installed in the porter cabin. So I saw him then as his corpse was brought to the British Military Hospital, because as soon as he was outside the prison, we became responsible for his security. In particular, I became responsible for his security. And I can tell you, it was definitely the Rudolph Hess that you've all seen in movies. And I saw him on 3 other occasions when he was alive, because when the Russians were on stag, he didn't like being in there if he could get away with it, because they took away his television. And I talked to him as he was wheeled in a couple of times into the hospital. So that was my background with Rudolph Hess. You know, fascinating part of my life it was, and we took it very seriously, actually. Joan Collins, because Berlin was one of those places that, you know, that was, you hardly could believe that you were there. It was something out of a novel, and yet we took our military role very seriously too. As a sort of, we were right out, if you like, in the middle of the group of Soviet forces, Germany, if they should have been silly enough to attack West Germany. So they took us quite seriously as well, in the belief we could do much more than we actually were able to. But anyway, quickly, Joan Collins, she came to present the prizes, or one set of prizes, in the Berlin Film Festival, which is quite a big do. And someone came to me, Major Andy Harris, who's a friend of mine, said, I've been asked if we can provide bodyguards to Joan Collins when she comes. I said, well, can't we get a sort of proper bodyguard company? He said, well, we look, but there aren't any. Don't forget, this is the Cold War. There weren't any in Berlin then. So I said, okay, I think we can do it. And I said, furthermore, I'll be one of them. So very amateurishly, something out of the Keystone Cops, we guarded Joan Collins for 24 hours, and a lot of fun it was.
Wow, what a great story. And of course, you've got a lovely picture of her signed by her, given to you. I think she was very grateful for you looking after her. A handsome army officer looking after a starlet. That was fantastic. The other thing which struck me in the book was you had a huge amount of experience in Afghanistan, and wrote your own diary, but also you met some amazing people when you were in that key role in Afghanistan. In particular, you were having these frequent conversations, discussions, guidance with President Karzai. What was he like, and what was it like writing your diary, and what are you going to do with the diary?
Well, let me just set the scene slightly, because why was I meeting these people, mainly politicians? It was because I was what's known in the trade, as you all know, as a theatre commander. So I was working pretty much at the strategic level often, certainly at the political level, and without doubt at something between the tactical and the high strategic, which, as you know, we call the operational level. So my role spanned everything from, should we, I don't know, attack a Taliban stronghold in Kandahar, through to meeting presidents and prime ministers and lesser mortals like Donald Rumsfeld. And I met the full gamut, because, of course, America had great interest in what we, the British Allied Rapid Reaction Corps headquarters, was doing. They had said to NATO, we want to focus on Iraq back in 2004. We'd like to hand over Afghanistan to NATO. And Tony Blair, who's another one I got to know pretty well, he said, well, we'll take it on using our ARC headquarters. And little did I know, as that conversation was taking place, that I was already slated to be the COMARC, you know, a year later. They would come through and took great interest in what we're doing, because, of course, both America from one perspective, but also all those European and other NATO nations from another, because they'd taken it on, wanted to know how things were and what made me tick. And it's not new, but it's very outside British operational experience. But in fact, since I was told, I don't know if this is true, but it sort of makes sense that I was the first British commander at the operational and at theatre level since World War II. Now, yeah. That's certainly
David Petraeus mentioned that. And you know, he mentioned you by name in his book. Yeah.
Oh, does he? Okay, I've got it. I must look at it. I mean, of course, I was the only non-American to command Afghanistan at that level, and Dave Petraeus is a very good friend. So that's why you do it. I mean, I remember the Italian ambassador who very kindly did a farewell. I would hardly call it a party, but some sort of reception when I had to leave. He said, sometimes we're baffled, David. Are you a talented politician masquerading as a general, or a talented general masquerading as a politician? And I sort of laughed beautifully, but it sort of give you a good feel for what you have to do. I'd say only 25% of my time was actually occupied with lower tactical level issues, and outstanding people from many nationalities. Broadly, I could give my intent to, as you'll remember. I didn't try to tell them how to do things. I told them what was required, and I might tweak the tiller occasionally, but give or take, I then got on with what I saw as my primary role.
Yeah, but what fascinating people you met. I mean, it's interesting. Andrew Roberts and David Petraeus had quite a sort of dig at Donald Rumsfeld for the strategies that he took in what went on, and particularly in Iraq, where they sort of missed the post the war, what they're going to do then, and it'll be fine, don't worry about it. But as you look back on Iraq and Afghanistan, do you think we could have done anything better to try and save it from the results that they've now ended up with, the situation they're now in? Could we have handled it differently?
It's an excellent question. I'm asked regularly. I went to Iraq a number of times, but I didn't serve there properly. I don't, I'm slightly reluctant to second guess people who I respect hugely and their view. But on Afghanistan, I have no doubt that we didn't have to leave when we did, and that I got into some trouble in 2010. I think I'd been appointed CDS, but I was still CGS. I said in an interview on the BBC, when asked how long did I think we would be involved in Afghanistan, I said probably for another 20 to 30 years. I got some criticism because they didn't analyze what I'd said, which was not in the combat role, but they will need our support for another 20 to 30 years. And, as was the case in Northern Ireland, as you know, and still is in some respects. So we didn't have to leave in the way we did, which was a strategic disaster, really. But when you go on military operations or go to war, and was Afghanistan a war? Well, we could talk about that, but as far as the soldiers were concerned, at the lower tactical level, most certainly was a war. And I think in many respects we didn't treat it as we should have done, which was to put full-bloodedly our effort into it, resources, military, mass, etc., etc. And as a result, we weren't there long enough, and we never really gained the traction we should have done. But the lesson for that is, if you're going to go to war, you either do it properly and full-bloodedly, or don't do it at all. And I think you can see that playing out in today's wars.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talking of today's wars, it's you're now in the House of Lords and hearing many of the discussions that are going on. There's obviously front of mind right now is the war with Israel in Gaza at the moment, and then I just wondered, did you see that developing that way, or were you as surprised as many were? And how do you see them militarily? What's the end state going to be, and how are they going to move on to the next stage, in your opinion? And it's just your opinion.
Yeah, okay. I can see this being on the front page of the Times if I'm not careful. The YouTube and all. Well, look, I think there's a tragedy here in two senses. One is the loss of life, most notably on the 7th of October, a dreadful atrocity committed by Hamas on the Israelis that were killed and taken hostage. But then, and I'm quite clear that what the Israelis have done since breaks my understanding of what is proportionately acceptable in terms of inflicting casualties on civilian populations, which is why the vast majority of the world are saying the same thing. And I think even though he might be criticized for not reining them in enough, I think it's quite clear that that's what President Biden also believes. And this, you'll remember from your own being taught at Sandhurst onwards, proportionality is very important. But I'm quite clear that we could not and would not do what the Israelis have been doing in the last 4 to 5 weeks. It breaks, I think, morally, but also legally. It's extremely questionable. Now, there had to be a military reaction. I'm quite clear on that. What would have been the alternative? Well, it probably would have been much more surgical, but it could have risked Israeli military lives much more. And the reason they have chosen to go down the route they have in large part is because they were not prepared to risk their lives, their soldiers' lives, more than was absolutely necessary. So they've used a lot of ordnance to do what we, in similar circumstances, might have had to risk our soldiers' lives doing, a more surgical approach. But that all said, you asked me whether I'd anticipated it. Not in the detail, no, but in another sense, yes. Until a political settlement, call it, for want of a better term, a two-state solution, but a solution that gives the Palestinian people the respect and dignity and a homeland that is so important to achieve that, then there will be generations of further Hamas terrorists who will do what Hamas and many, many other Palestinians will, instinctively feel they have no option but to do. So I always thought it's a perennial war, given the nature of the beast and what is at stake. Will they achieve, just quickly, achieve their tactical objectives? I don't think so. I think it's almost impossible to eradicate Hamas in the way that the Israelis are hoping to. They might neutralize them for a while, but even if they don't remain in Gaza, they will form up and come back in another way. I suppose the other thing that I'd had to say, linked to it, is that the Israelis have squandered that most precious commodity in war, but particular in this day and age, which is they've lost the strategic messaging. So if you like, even if they win tactically, which I think is a big if, but they might, I think they're losing strategically. And it was Sun Tzu, and you'll remember this probably, who famously and so rightly said that strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, but tactics without strategy is merely the noise before defeat. And you can apply that in any walk of life, but most certainly in our walk of life. And that's what I find is pretty tragic, because the Israeli people deserved a better long-term response to what Hamas did so dreadfully a few weeks ago.
Yeah, no, I completely find that spot on, and it's interesting that the ghost at the feast is Iran, and I've just been listening to Empire, which is a very good podcast series, and they've just been covering. They did a lot on Russia and the lead up to the Ukraine war, but they've been doing a lot on Persia and Iran and its history and its how great an empire it was in Darius and various people like that, and leading up to Marathon. It's fascinating. And then to the modern age. But now we have Iran, which many of my friends who either got injured, such as a number of friends I met in Help for Heroes when I was cycling in northern France around the battlefields, raising money for Help for Heroes. But they said, the ordnance that blew me up was supplied by the Revolutionary Guard of Iran. and put across the border into either Afghanistan or into Iraq. And then here we have Hezbollah with 100,000 troops trained by Iran, Hamas with 30 to 40,000 people down in the Houthis and sending rockets, all in the background, sort of this tension between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and all that goes on. What do we do about Iran? And it's the one that no one wants to really talk about, but it's all there in the background, and it's linked with Russia, of course, who's delighted that this is going on because it takes the heat off Ukraine.
Well, certainly on your latter point, there's no doubt about that. What I would say, I mean, it's a hugely complex issue. You know that just, well, not better than me. So I can only give you a few wave tops. But first of all, I'm pretty certain Iran did not, if you like, order the Hamas attack. The Israeli security and intelligence apparatus should be ashamed of their failure on the 7th of July. Clearly, at the tactical level, it was rotten. But at the strategic level, linked to American effort, I believe that if the Iranians were causing this to happen, we would have found out. And the Israelis are as good as said they would. Why did, first of all, you should dismiss, if you like, tactical control of Hamas's activity in respect to the 7th of October. Why do I think that is likely beyond there's no evidence of it, depending which rotten podcast or website you go on, because there's lots of conspiracy theories. But I mean, I'm getting this from pretty good authority, put it that way, because actually Iran was getting quite close to a deal with Saudi Arabia. It's got relations now with Bahrain and the UAE. It sort of was winning to some degree the propaganda war with the USA, and the USA themselves were sort of soft peddling on Iran. We have diplomatic relations with them, etc., etc. So yes, they have, particularly IRGC, one sense is a bit out of control, has been fomenting a lot of this. But in respect of what's happened in Gaza, I think there's pretty compelling evidence that just they didn't have their fingerprints directly on it. Why not, though, accept the strategic case for dealing in whatever way one might with Iran? Well, because we don't and shouldn't want to go to war with any country unless we really, really got to. And our quote, and this is vital, to our vital national interests are at stake. And it would take some convincing for me to say right now we have to go to war as part of a Western American-led coalition with Iran. I would like to find a way, and there was a thing called the JCPOA, which you'll remember goes back a number of years now, a deal being done with Iran about nuclear weapons. And there were cynics, but broadly there was a consensus amongst people I sort of respected that this was probably a good thing. We ought to give it a fair win. That's now sort of off the table as far as I can tell. But I must say two other things. Hezbollah, interestingly, have not used those 100,000, and I think Iran does not want a regional war, and therefore we shouldn't precipitate it. I mean, you ask what we do in the long term. Well, there can be only one right way, and that's to play a long game and induce them through a proper combination of carrot and stick back into the international community. Because the alternative is one day we'll have war, and it could be a nuclear war. And the first victims of that, as strong as they are, could well be Israel, which we don't want.
No. I mean, as you say, there's so many layers within this, but then it does take us back to that other link, an area you know so much about with Russia, which you've studied all your life from being a young officer in the Cold War like I was, and imagining them rumbling across the border. I was at a very interesting meeting as ADC with Field Marshal Inge, the head of the West German Army, the head of the East German Police, and the head of the East German army. And it was just as the wall had just come down. It was post that, about a few weeks later. And this fascinating conversation between both sides, where the East Germans said, "We knew you were going to invade us." And Peter went, "No, we weren't." I said, "No, you were. We just knew you were coming across any minute. So we had our tanks, even though our barracks were in terrible state, we turned our tanks over every 30 minutes because we knew you were coming." No, we weren't. We thought you were coming. And so this impression they had of each other. And then the fascinating one was the head of the East German police. He said, "Honecker told me to shoot the West Germans on the wall." And he said, there I was. I had my DACA. I had my family in lovely supermarkets, special supermarkets for Communist Party members. My life was sorted. And I had a decision to make, a moral decision. Do I shoot these innocent Western people on the wall, or do I disobey Honecker and watch the whole thing unravel? And he said, I chose to disobey him. And no one knows much about this, but that was a decision that the whole thing unraveled. But he made the right decision, but it cost him his whole career, his life, his family, everything that went with it. But it's interesting, the unsung heroes in history.
Yeah.
Decisions they had to make.
Very interesting story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't actually in Berlin when the wall actually came down, but I can tell I left in January of that year. We had no inkling, with the benefit of hindsight, maybe we were beginning to see signs, but they weren't picked up. And certainly if they were, they weren't fed to us at my lowly level. But I think on Russia, it's a good point you make through your tale there. NATO expansion, and in particular, the idea that Ukraine should become part of NATO. Now, to us, that's no threat. NATO, we're not an aggressive organization, rightly so, but not through Russian eyes. And so, a succession of diplomatic gaffes, political sort of over-assurance in the 90s and then 2000s, notably President Bush inviting Georgia and Ukraine openly to join NATO and say, you will join NATO. To a Russian, that was threatening. And in that respect, the great Henry Kissinger, who we heard today has just died, I think was absolutely right. But we are where we are today in Ukraine. I think, you're right, I do have some knowledge, maybe more than the average, about Russia, because I was the Soviet Army DS at Camberley, at the Army Staff College, for 2 years. And I also studied Russian history at university. And I remember being interviewed in March last year, and being seen by some people as a bit of a peacenik or surrender monkey in respect of Russia, when I said that I think we're already underestimating their resilience and robustness. And I drew that from history. You think about 26 million Russians died in World War II, massively more than Americans and British and French combined, for example. And they have a habit of learning their lessons and coming back. And I always thought that for Ukraine, unless she was given all the kit and more that she began to ask for as early as March, April last year, that there was no way that they could regain that territory. And sadly, in many respects, I've been proved right. The deduction for me, going back to the point I made earlier, is you only go to war if your vital national interests are at stake. I know people who would say that Ukraine's interests are our vital national interests. Cold-bloodedly, I don't agree with that. But even more importantly, and this is the key fact, if you go to war, you must do it to win and win quickly. That means you have to have what Colin Powell called overwhelming power. Weight of military muscle. The blooming Ukrainians, much to our shame, are going to war at the moment and dying in large quantities. There's huge numbers of people without arms and legs, for example, many more than I think we're being told. who are fighting for a cause which I fear cannot be realized, i.e. the regaining of the four oblasts and Crimea. There's a moral issue here for all of us. Should we encourage Ukraine to go on doing this when we're almost certain, unless we are suddenly going to give them everything they need, and I see no sign of it, Gaza's further taken our eyes off it, that unless you are, you really should find an alternative, because it's immoral in the extreme. And I go back to my Verdun analogy. It's not right that we should do this to people. And I fear we're now in that game, and we need to reorder it or give them the kit they need.
Yeah, I think it's a very realistic appraisal, sadly, and people feel that if Donald Trump, and I don't know whether in your travels you ever got the chance to meet the Donald, but if he gets back in, heaven help us, which he might do, he's probably likely to go more pro-Russian than pro-Ukrainian, and probably withdraw the support for Ukraine, and then they're really stuffed. I don't know what your thought is if that happened.
Okay, well, first of all, I never met him, but I did appear accidentally because his election team distorted something I said in an interview. So I have got a picture that was on a website of me and him together. But to answer your question, which I send friends and they find Riley very amusing, but and I'm not getting into the politics of it, because whoever the American people vote in, we need to work with them. And in one area, and this is why, by the way, it was in his website, I said he's saying certain things that perhaps we don't all approve of, but on one area he's right, which is we must spend more on our own defence, we in Europe, and that's why he sort of adopted me in some way for about a nanosecond. Yeah, I feel that that Russia. What was the nub of your question, Jonathan?
I was wondering. Yes, okay, no, it's fascinating. I was wondering if someone like Donald Trump does get in, that his more pro-Russian stance than Ukrainian might mean that the Ukrainians finally lose that huge amount of material and financial support for infrastructure, electricity, all the rest that's going on in the background that people don't know about from America, because he'll say, enough, we're not giving any more.
Yeah. Okay. Well, of course, they have got a huge amount, probably between Europe and America, something like $200 billion worth of support. Remember, though, a vast amount of that is going into the pay packets and others of defense companies, mainly in America too. So it's not as if we're giving them $200 billion. And the time it's taking to get that kit to the Ukrainians is ridiculous, but actually, when you're not on a war footing, probably entirely inevitable. So it's why I question the strategy always was flawed, potentially. But I think more that Donald Trump, if he does get back into power and he takes the rug from under the Ukrainian effort, it won't be so much or just because he wants the Russians to win in some sense. Although I think he's quite a big state man. He likes the idea of, China, Russia, America running the world, give or take. And he's not the only one. To some degree, Henry Kissinger was a bit like that. He called it the sort of the school of realpolitik. And there's something to be said for it, but I don't think we can go down that rabbit warren. But I think it'll be because he wants the war to stop. And in that respect, he's right, because if we dig in for a long drawn out conflict in Ukraine, and there are many people who are now saying that's what we've got to do, it's inevitable. I mean, just analyze what that means. We're talking maybe years of a destabilizing war in Europe. Certainly on the very edges of Europe, that could go badly wrong. Either side could make mistakes. Russia could get adventurous. Ukraine could get adventurous in attempts to catalyze a new situation. So it's not instinctively, from my perspective, something that we should encourage. If we aren't going to give them the kit they need, and I think we're almost at the point where we're not going to, because physically, don't forget, the Russians also have a vote. They're building up their stocks and learning all sorts of lessons, and still got a massive, big population to draw on. But probably what will happen is President Zelensky, who's got a real problem, because he has said we will only stop when we have regained the Oblasts and Crimea. But assuming he is the statesman we all hope, if he sees that that is inevitably not going to happen, that he does some sort of deal trading land for security, I think what will then happen is that we will give some very strong security guarantees to the 80% of Ukraine that remains free, and we'll turn the Ukrainian military into a defensive organization rather than offensive, which being, as we all know, the defense is broadly easier, and we'll give them a lot of kit so that it becomes almost impossible. And my model really here is South Korea, North Korea. Free Ukraine becomes a very prosperous, successful country within the EU, hopefully. In the meanwhile, Russia has been defeated strategically, because we've got to remember and keep reminding people that President Putin failed in his attempts to retake the country as a whole. He's actually got what he already had, which we didn't go to war with him over in 2014, and a bit more. So he hasn't really succeeded. He will be able to tell his people he's succeeded, and he needs to be able to do a bit of that. I live in the real world, but actually strategically he's failed. And NATO, in the meanwhile, has got bigger and stronger. I mean, that's not a great success on his part. And I think we then play a long game. And hopefully, as is perhaps going to be the case in Korea, in 30, 40 years' time, the good people of Russia and the Ukrainians come together again in some deal. So that's how I would see it. But, I'm the biggest peacenik on this land, in this globe, having seen a bit of, what war's about.
Yeah, well, particularly books like The Bloodlands, about the 20 million people who were lost in that area between Russia and Germany, not even in the wars, just between the wars. Yeah. We should learn from it, and just the resilience that the Russians have, just to take punishment after punishment after punishment and not give up. And the depth of their defenses are just, like around Kursk, just massively deep, and no one can get through them. We're coming almost to the end, tragically, and we're going to end in a moment with your top tip, your leadership top tip. Before we do, you've met some fascinating people. I want to touch on your little thumbnail sketch of the nicest characteristics of a couple of politicians you met, and then the royal family, two members of the royal family. Firstly, Tony Blair and David Cameron. Obviously, David Cameron's in the news a lot, and so is Tony Blair with his foundation. What do you see as the best leadership qualities of both those people? Everybody can be critical, but what do you see as the best leadership qualities of those two politicians?
Well, they're both very personable, natural. Tony Blair, the first time I met him, he made me think that I was very special. I was a lieutenant general by then, because I never met him during Sierra Leone. I got messages from him, but I never met him. So the first time I met him was, wrapped around Afghanistan. But more importantly, I remember I took my AD. I used to, unlike American generals, I often tease about this, I travel pretty light. So I used to go everywhere just with my ADC. And we arrived at number 10. And Simon came in with me, a chap called Simon Briggs. And someone came out of the Prime Minister's office, and he said hello to me, and then he looked at Simon and what's he going to do? I said, well, can he come in with me? There's no reason, there's only two of us. It'd be a great treat to meet the Prime Minister. And Tony Blair came out and heard me say that and said, of course he can. And he treated him as a very important person. And I think, that at a personal level is really important. The other thing I'd say about Tony Blair was, I think he thought strategically. and was and still is something of a statesman. And I give a pretty bad talk on with a statecraft, with a statesman. There aren't many around, certainly in the Western world. And David Cameron, I think, is a rather similar character. He made you feel wanted and important, and at least on the surface took your view into account. I teased him quite a lot, and he sort of teased me back. I think he called me a maverick. But if you employ a maverick, you expect to be ticked off again or something, he said. But on him, and I hope perhaps he's having another go at this, I said in my book, I think, he has all the makings of a statesman, but he hadn't yet developed into one. And I think, although it sounds rather critical, it's not really meant to be. I think you do grow into being a statesman. It's not automatic. And one of the failings of our system is that they don't train themselves. They don't put themselves through a staff college, in being a statesman. So that's what I'd say about the two of them.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then lovely picture in your book of you with the Queen. Love your fondest memories of her, and then finally of our new king and the connection with the military, which you're still very closely tied with.
Well, yes. I mean, of course, there is a rule that you don't really talk about conversations you've had with the Queen or with the monarch, but I mean, she's no longer with us, sadly, and I have only the fondest memories of her. And I was asked when she died, and I did appear in a couple of sort of minor media events. But I think her sense of humour has to be my abiding memory, and a very sharp sense of humour. I mean, I remember another king, an Arab king, telling her with me there that I was advising him, and she looked at me and then looked at the king and said to him, so rather inquisitively, she said, "Is that wise?" We laughed so much. And that's just one example. And then the photo in the book, the RAF flew over the wrong tower at Windsor Castle when we were doing the Jubilee event. We then went down to Windsor Great Park where the RAF were doing another fly past. And she turned to me and said, "I do hope they go over the right place this time." But, things like that. So she's lovely. Yeah. I miss her dreadfully, but we have in King Charles a wonderful successor. He's extremely conscientious. I worked with him on a number of occasions, not least because I had the great honour to be Colonel Commandant Brigadier Gurkhas, and he is a very senior part of the brigade and much loved. So I think, aren't we lucky? You could not ask for a more conscientious or well-intentioned or I think, dare I say it, but more intelligent monarch that wants to help us subtly and sensitively in a direction which I think we all broadly agree with. So I think we're terribly lucky.
Yeah, fantastic. So finally, and this is a clip in its own right, if you'd kindly introduce yourself, because this will be a standalone piece, what you're doing now and what you were doing before in your career, and then leave us with your practical top leadership tip for people in the 125 countries around the world that listen to this podcast.
Well, no pressure. I've forgotten this bit, Jonathan. I'm General David Richards. I had the great privilege to serve in the British Army for 42 years and ended up as the chief of formerly the head of the 3 armed forces in Britain. Is that something is that enough?
That's good.
Okay. What's my great tip? I think never think you're too good to ask advice and take advice from whoever is appropriate, whether lowly people or great leaders, statesmen or whatever. So humility, I think, is vital in leadership, and moral courage equally so, knowing when to say no, that's not right, unless ABC happens. And I think the other thing is enjoying the company of everyone that you might come across and be thankful for it. Too many people, to my observation, sort of don't really seem to enjoy being in the company of others, or a bit obsessed with themselves. Just put your arm around people occasionally and say something nice, and you will never cease to be surprised how they will repay that loyalty and interest. And I think that's what I most remember.
Fantastic. Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure and a great honor to have you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast. And thank you very much for your insights.
No, thank you, Jonathan. And well done, you.